My name is Dante Ricci, and I own Desert Eagle Firearms in Phoenix, Arizona. 3 days ago, my regular customer tried to eat me alive. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning became the first 72 hours of hell on earth. I watched. My city burned from behind bulletproof glass while zombies learned to hunt in packs. Every bullet I fired, every door I barricaded, every person I couldn't save taught me that surviving the apocalypse means making impossible choices. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Tuesday, July 15th started like any other summer morning in Phoenix. I woke up at 5:30, had my black coffee, and checked the weather forecast on my phone. 112 degrees. Not the worst we'd seen that summer, but hot enough to make the asphalt shimmer like water by noon. I'd been running Desert Eagle Firearms and training for 15 years, and I knew the routine by heart. Unlock the doors at 7, check the overnight security footage, prep the range for the day's customers, and try to stay cool in the desert heat that could kill you if you weren't careful. My name is Dante Ricci, and I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened during those first 12 hours. I wasn't some paranoid survivalist living in a bunker. I was a legitimate businessman who happened to believe that preparation saves lives. My grandfather fought in World War II, and he taught me that the world can change in an instant. That's why I kept my store stocked with enough ammunition to supply a small army, why I installed military-grade security systems, and why I always had 3 months of food and water stored in my back office. People called me overcautious. After what happened, I realized I wasn't cautious enough. The store sat on a corner lot on 43rd Avenue, about 20 minutes from downtown Phoenix. I'd chosen the location specifically because it had good sightlines in all directions and only 2 points of entry I needed to secure. The main entrance faced the street, reinforced with steel frames and bulletproof glass. The back door opened into a small parking area where I accepted deliveries. Both entrances had electronic locks, security cameras, and steel shutters I could activate from a control panel in my office. The building itself was concrete block construction, designed to withstand both the desert heat and anything else that might come my way. Inside, I kept the retail area organized like a military armory. Handguns in locked display cases, rifles mounted on the walls behind the counter, and ammunition stocked in a separate room with its own security system. The shooting range occupied the back half of the building, soundproofed and ventilated, with targets at various distances. I'd installed a small apartment upstairs where I sometimes stayed during busy periods or when I wanted to keep an eye on the place overnight. Most importantly, I had a comprehensive security system with cameras covering every angle of the property. That system would save my life more times than I could count. That Tuesday morning, I arrived at 6:45 and immediately noticed something strange on the security monitor. The cameras had recorded movement in the parking lot around 2 in the morning. Not unusual by itself, but when I reviewed the footage, I saw 3 people standing near the back entrance, just standing there for almost an hour. They weren't trying to break in, weren't looking for an opportunity to steal anything. They were just watching the building, studying it like they were memorizing every detail. Their body language seemed wrong somehow, too still, too focused. I made a mental note to check the footage more carefully later and went about my morning routine. The first customer arrived at 7:15. Regular guy named Mike who came in every couple weeks for target practice. He seemed normal enough, complained about the heat, bought a box of 9mm rounds, and spent 30 minutes on the range before heading to work. Nothing unusual there. The second customer was Mrs. Patterson, and that's when everything started to fall apart. Eleanor Patterson was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd been coming to my range every Thursday for 3 years. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with gray hair always pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a Smith & Wesson Model 60 revolver, nothing fancy, just a reliable .38 that she'd inherited from her late husband. She was polite, precise, and had never caused a moment of trouble. When she walked through my door that Tuesday morning instead of her usual Thursday, I should have known something was wrong. She stumbled when she entered, catching herself on the doorframe with more force than necessary. Her gray hair was disheveled, matted with sweat despite the air conditioning. Her usual neat appearance was gone, replaced by clothes that looked like she'd slept in them. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were bloodshot, wide, and completely unfocused, like she was looking through me, instead of at me. I set down the Glock I'd been cleaning and walked around the counter toward her. Professional concern, nothing more. Mrs. Patterson had never missed her weekly appointment, never shown up on the wrong day, never looked anything less than perfectly composed. This wasn't normal behavior for her, and in my business, you learn to pay attention to abnormal behavior. She didn't respond when I called her name. Instead, she made the sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It was low, wet, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of water. The sound came from deep in her throat, and it made every instinct I'd developed over 15 years of dealing with potentially dangerous people scream at me to get away from her. I stopped walking toward her and reached for the tactical knife I kept clipped to my belt. Not because I wanted to hurt Mrs. Patterson, but because something fundamental had changed about her, something that made her dangerous despite her age and size. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw intelligence there. Not the confused, drug-addled stare of someone having a breakdown, but focused, predatory intelligence. She was studying me the same way those 3 people in the parking lot had studied my building. When she attacked, it happened faster than should have been possible for a woman her age. She lunged across the space between us with strength that defied everything I knew about human physiology. Her small hands became claws, reaching for my face with coordination that seemed impossible given her condition. I barely had time to bring up my arms to protect myself before she was on me, driving me backward into the wall behind the counter. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but adrenaline and 15 years of tactical training took over. I grabbed her wrists and tried to control her arms, but she was incredibly strong, stronger than any 71-year-old woman should be. She kept making that wet, growling sound, and I could smell something wrong with her breath, something rotten and sweet that made my stomach turn. She tried to bite me. Not scratch, not hit, but bite. Her teeth snapped inches from my face, and I realized that whatever was wrong with Mrs. Patterson, it wasn't a mental breakdown or a drug reaction. This was something else entirely, something that had turned a gentle retired teacher into a predator who wanted to tear my throat out with her teeth. I managed to get one hand free and grab the tactical knife from my belt. The blade was 4 inches of high-carbon steel, designed for utility work, but sharp enough to do damage if necessary. I didn't want to hurt her, but she was trying to kill me, and every second I hesitated gave her another chance to succeed. The knife went into her chest just below the rib cage, angled upward toward her heart. In any normal situation, that would have ended the fight immediately. A 71-year-old woman with a knife in her chest should have collapsed, should have stopped attacking, should have at least shown some reaction to the pain. Mrs. Patterson kept fighting like nothing had happened. I twisted the knife and drove it deeper, and she finally stopped trying to bite me. But she didn't scream, didn't cry out, didn't show any of the normal human responses to severe injury. She just looked at me with those bloodshot eyes and made that wet growling sound. Again. Then she collapsed, not like someone who'd been mortally wounded, but like a machine that had suddenly been switched off. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Mrs. Patterson lay motionless on my floor, the knife still buried in her chest, her eyes staring at nothing. Blood was spreading across the linoleum, dark red and still warm. I just killed a customer, a woman I'd known for 3 years, a retired schoolteacher who collected ceramic angels and always brought homemade cookies to the range on holidays. But I knew, even then, that whatever had attacked me wasn't really Mrs. Patterson anymore. The person I'd known was gone, replaced by something that retained her memories and intelligence, but had lost everything that made her human. She'd known exactly how to get into my store, exactly where to find me, exactly how to move through the space to corner me. That wasn't random violence or drug-induced psychosis. That was hunting behavior. I pulled the knife out and wiped it clean on a shop rag, then dragged her body into the back room where customers couldn't see it. I locked the front door and activated the security shutters, then went to wash the blood off my hands and try to figure out what to do next. The water ran red down the drain, and I noticed my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from adrenaline and the knowledge that something fundamental had changed about the world. That's when I turned on the radio and heard the first emergency broadcast. The announcer's voice was carefully controlled, professional, but I could hear the strain underneath the words. Reports of unusual incidents of violence across the Phoenix metropolitan area. Citizens advised to avoid drinking tap water until further notice. Anyone experiencing flu-like symptoms should seek immediate medical attention. The broadcast repeated 3 times, then cut to static. I tried my cell phone, but the networks were jammed. Busy signals, dropped calls, automated messages about high call volumes. I managed to get through to my sister in Tucson, but she hung up when I tried to explain what had happened. She thought I was having some kind of breakdown, that the heat and isolation had finally gotten to me. Maybe I thought the same thing for a few minutes, until I looked out the window and saw what was happening in the streets. The first thing I noticed was the cars. Traffic on 43rd Avenue had come to a complete stop, not because of construction or an accident, but because drivers were abandoning their vehicles. I watched a woman in a blue sedan open her door, step out onto the asphalt, and start walking away from her car like she'd forgotten it existed. She moved with the same purposeful stride Mrs. Patterson had used when she attacked me, focused and determined, but somehow wrong. More people were emerging from buildings, from houses, from parked cars. They all moved the same way, with that strange, predatory focus. They didn't seem to notice the heat, didn't seek shade, didn't show any of the normal behaviors you'd expect from people caught outside in 100-degree weather. They just walked, all in the same general direction, like they were following some invisible signal. I grabbed my binoculars and climbed to the 2nd floor to get a better view. From the apartment window, I could see for blocks in every direction. What I saw made my blood run cold. Groups of people were forming throughout the neighborhood, gathering in parking lots, in front of businesses, in the street itself. They stood motionless, like they were waiting for something, and every few minutes more would join them. But it was the way they moved that really frightened me. When they walked, they moved in formation, not like a crowd of individuals, but like a single organism with multiple parts. They avoided obstacles with coordinated precision, split around barriers and reformed on the other side, moved with purpose toward objectives I couldn't identify. This wasn't random mob behavior. This was organized, intelligent, and completely inhuman. I went back downstairs and started loading magazines. 30-round magazines for the AR-15, 15-round magazines for the Glock, even the big drum. Magazines I kept for special occasions. If whatever had happened to Mrs. Patterson was spreading, if those people outside were about to become as dangerous as she'd been, I needed to be ready for a fight. The radio crackled with more emergency broadcasts. Avoid large gatherings, stay indoors. Do not approach anyone exhibiting unusual behavior. The euphemisms were getting more creative, but the message was clear. Something was turning people into predators, and the authorities had no idea how to stop it. By 10 o'clock, the power started flickering. Not unusual during Phoenix summers when everyone cranked their air conditioning, but this felt different. The lights would dim, surge back to normal, then dim again, like the electrical grid was under some kind of strain it wasn't designed to handle. I had backup generators and battery systems, but I knew they wouldn't last forever. The first real test came at 11:15. I was monitoring the security cameras when I saw a group of maybe 8 people approaching the front of my store. They moved in that same coordinated way I'd observed from the window, spreading out to cover all the angles, positioning themselves like they were preparing for a tactical assault. These weren't random infected wandering around looking for trouble. These were hunters who'd identified a target and were planning their attack. I activated the external speakers and warned them away. Most of them ignored me completely, but 2 turned toward the cameras with that same predatory focus Mrs. Patterson had shown. They could hear me, could understand what I was saying, but they didn't care about warnings or threats. They wanted something inside my store, and they were going to take it. They tested the front door first, pushing against it, examining the hinges, looking for weaknesses. When that didn't work, they moved to the windows, running their hands along the frames, checking for gaps or vulnerable points. They were learning my defenses, mapping out every detail of my security system. Not randomly, not instinctively, but with the methodical patience of professional soldiers. I fired a warning shot through the small speaking slot in the front door. The bullet hit the pavement 3 feet from the nearest person, and they all stopped what they were doing to look at the impact point. They understood what a gunshot meant, understood the threat it represented, but instead of running away, they adjusted their positions to minimize their exposure while continuing their examination of my store. That's when I knew for certain that whatever had happened to Mrs. Patterson was spreading, and the people it infected retained their intelligence and memories while losing their humanity. They could plan, could coordinate, could learn from their mistakes, but they no longer cared about personal safety, social conventions, or anything else that made them human. They'd become something else entirely, something that saw other people as prey. I spent the next hour watching them work. They didn't try to break in immediately, didn't waste energy on futile attacks against my security measures. Instead, they mapped every inch of my building, tested every possible entry point, and observed how I responded to their presence. They were gathering intelligence, preparing for a more sophisticated assault. Around noon, they disappeared as suddenly as they'd arrived. Not because they'd given up, but because they'd learned what they needed to know. They'd return later, probably with more people, probably with a better plan. I used the time to double-check my weapons, verify my ammunition count, and prepare for a siege that I knew was coming. The heat outside had reached 115 degrees, hot enough to kill an unprepared person in minutes. But the infected didn't seem to notice. They moved through the blazing sun without seeking shade, without showing any signs of heat exhaustion, without any of the survival behaviors that should have been instinctive. Whatever had changed them had also changed their relationship with the physical world. By 1 o'clock, the emergency broadcasts had stopped using euphemisms. Reports of widespread violence, complete breakdown of emergency services, instructions to barricade yourself indoors and avoid contact with anyone exhibiting aggressive behavior. The announcers were trying to maintain their professional composure, but I could hear the fear in their voices. They knew they were reporting on the end of civilization as we knew it. I tried calling my ex-wife in California, my brother in Colorado, anyone who might be far enough away to escape whatever was happening in Phoenix. The phone networks were completely jammed now, nothing but busy signals and error messages. I was cut off from the outside world, trapped in my fortified store with a dead body in the back room and groups of infected people studying my defenses. The power failed completely at 2:47 in the afternoon. No flicker, no gradual dimming, Just instant darkness and silence as the electrical grid collapsed under whatever strain had been building all morning. My backup generators kicked in automatically, but I knew they had maybe 12 hours of fuel. After that, I'd be running on battery power alone. I spent the rest of the afternoon monitoring the security cameras and trying to understand what I was dealing with. The infected moved in larger groups now, 20 or 30 people working together with military precision. They'd established what looked like patrol routes through the neighborhood, covering every street and alley with systematic thoroughness. They were hunting, searching for survivors, and they were good at it. Around 4 o'clock, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of infected had cornered a family 3 blocks away, a man and woman with 2 small children who'd been trying to reach their car. The infected didn't attack immediately. Instead, they herded the family away from the vehicle, driving them toward a dead-end alley where escape would be impossible. They were using tactics, coordinating their movements to achieve a specific objective. I couldn't see what happened next, but I didn't need to. The infected had learned to hunt in packs to use strategy and coordination to overcome their prey. They weren't mindless monsters shambling around looking for victims. They were intelligent predators who'd retained their human knowledge while losing their human compassion. As the sun started to set, I made final preparations for what I knew would be a long night. I loaded every weapon I owned, positioned ammunition, caches throughout the store, and set up defensive positions that would give me clear fields of fire toward both entrances. I had enough food and water for several days, enough ammunition to fight a small war, and enough determination to make anyone who tried to take my store pay dearly for the privilege. But I also knew that I was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy that could think, plan, and adapt. Whatever had happened to Mrs. Patterson was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and the infected were getting organized. They'd studied my defenses, learned my routines, and identified me as a target worth pursuing. The temperature outside was still over 100 degrees even after sunset, but I could see groups of infected moving through the streets with increasing frequency. They were preparing for something, gathering in larger numbers, positioning themselves for coordinated action. I had maybe an hour before they decided to make their move. I checked my weapons one final time, made sure the security system was fully operational, and tried to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. Whatever Mrs. Patterson had become, whatever had infected the people outside, it was about to test every skill I'd learned, every preparation I'd made, every plan I'd developed for surviving the unthinkable. The first day of the apocalypse was almost over, but the real test was just beginning. The sun disappeared behind the Phoenix skyline at 7:30, but the temperature barely dropped below 100 degrees. I'd been through plenty of desert nights before, but this one felt different. The usual sounds of the city were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made every small noise seem amplified. No traffic, no air conditioners humming, no normal human activity. Just the occasional distant scream and the sound of my own breathing in the suffocating heat. I positioned myself at the security monitor in my office, where I could watch all 6 camera feeds simultaneously. The infrared sensors showed movement everywhere, dozens of heat signatures moving through the streets in patterns that looked almost military in their precision. They weren't wandering aimlessly like I'd expected. They were patrolling, covering specific routes, maintaining communication with other groups through methods I couldn't understand. Around 8 o'clock, I got my first real look at how organized they'd become. A group of maybe 15 infected had surrounded the Martinez family's house 2 blocks down. I'd sold Roberto Martinez his first handgun 3 years ago, helped him learn to shoot when his neighborhood started getting rougher. He was a good man, worked construction, had 2 teenage daughters and a wife who made the best tamales in Phoenix. The infected didn't just rush the house like wild animals. They positioned themselves at every exit, tested the doors and windows systematically, and then waited. They were patient, disciplined, working together like a SWAT team preparing for a coordinated breach. When they finally moved, it was with surgical precision. 3 through the front door, 2 through the back, the rest covering escape routes. The whole operation took maybe 90 seconds. I wanted to help, but I was 800 yards away with no way to reach them without exposing myself to the dozens of infected between my store and their house. All I could do was watch and learn from what I was seeing. These things retained their human intelligence and knowledge, but they'd lost something essential that made them human. They could plan, coordinate, and execute complex operations, but they felt no compassion, no hesitation, no moral restraints. The radio was still functioning on battery power, picking up scattered transmissions from emergency services, amateur radio operators, and desperate survivors trying to coordinate with each other. Most of the professional broadcasters had gone silent, but I managed to find a few stations still transmitting. The news was uniformly bad. Similar outbreaks in Tucson, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, and other southwestern cities. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and traditional emergency response was completely overwhelmed. Around 9:30, I heard a transmission that made my blood run cold. A Phoenix police officer was reporting from the downtown area, describing infected individuals who seemed to be organizing into larger groups, establishing territory, and showing signs of what he called tactical thinking. He mentioned seeing them use tools, coordinate complex maneuvers, and adapt their behavior based on the responses of survivors. Then his transmission cut to static, and I never heard from him again. I started picking up civilian radio traffic around 10 o'clock. Scattered voices in the darkness, people trying to find family members, survivors barricaded in their homes, a few groups attempting to organize rescue operations. Most of the transmissions were brief, desperate, and ended abruptly. But I managed to make contact with someone who would become crucial to my survival over the next few days. Her name was Sarah Chun, and she was a nurse at Phoenix General Hospital. She'd been working the night shift when the first infected patient started arriving, and she'd witnessed the early stages of the outbreak from inside the medical system. Sarah had managed to secure herself in one of the hospital's emergency supply rooms, and she had access to medical equipment, communications, and most importantly, information about what was happening from a scientific perspective. Sarah's voice was calm and professional when she answered my radio call, but I could hear the strain underneath. She'd been dealing with this crisis for hours longer than I had, and she'd seen things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she was also a trained medical professional who understood disease transmission, human physiology, and crisis management. She became my lifeline to the outside world and my source of crucial information about what we were dealing with. According to Sarah, the hospital had received its first infected patients around 6 in the morning, about 3 hours before Mrs. Patterson attacked me. They'd presented with symptoms that initially looked like severe dehydration and heat exhaustion, but their vital signs were completely wrong. Elevated heart rate, abnormal brain activity, and most disturbingly, they showed no response to pain. The medical staff had tried to treat them as normal patients until they started attacking the doctors and nurses. Sarah had been in the break room when the first outbreak occurred in the emergency department. She'd heard screaming, alarms, and then an announcement over the hospital's internal communication system, ordering all staff to evacuate the building immediately. But Sarah was smart enough to realize that fleeing into the streets might be more dangerous than staying put. She'd barricaded herself in the supply room and had been monitoring radio, communications, and trying to coordinate with other survivors ever since. She told me something that confirmed my worst fears about the infected. They retained their memories, their knowledge, their ability to reason and plan. But they'd lost their empathy, their fear, their social conditioning, and their concern for self-preservation. They were still human in terms of intelligence and physical capabilities, but they'd become something else entirely in terms of motivation and behavior. They wanted to hunt, to spread whatever had changed them, and they were very good at both. Sarah had been tracking the infection spread through radio, communications, and medical data she'd accessed from the hospital's computer system. The initial outbreak had been centered around the water treatment facility on the west side of Phoenix, but it had spread rapidly through the municipal water supply to every neighborhood in the city. Anyone who'd consumed tap water in the past 24 hours was potentially infected, and the incubation period seemed to be between 6 and 12 hours. The infected weren't random in their behavior. They were targeting specific locations, specific people, specific objectives. They seemed to be looking for survivors who might pose a threat to their expansion, and they were particularly interested in places with weapons, medical supplies, and communication equipment. My gun store checked all 3 boxes, which explained why I'd been receiving so much attention from the groups patrolling my neighborhood. Around 11 o'clock, Sarah made contact with several other survivors scattered throughout the city. There was a group of Phoenix police officers who'd barricaded themselves in the central precinct, a family of 5 holed up in a fortified house in Scottsdale, and a handful of other individuals like me who'd managed to secure defensive positions. We started coordinating our radio schedules, sharing information, and discussing the possibility of linking up for mutual support. But even as we were talking, the situation was getting worse. The infected groups were getting larger, more organized, and more aggressive. They were no longer just patrolling neighborhoods or hunting isolated survivors. They were launching coordinated attacks on defended positions, using tactics that suggested they were learning from each encounter and adapting their strategies accordingly. That's when I witnessed something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. Around midnight, I watched through my security cameras as a group of infected approached the gun store across the street from mine. The owner, a man named Frank Morrison, had tried to secure his building the same way I had. Steel shutters, reinforced doors, defensive positions inside. But he'd made the mistake of using his weapon early in the evening, firing at infected individuals who were just testing his defenses. The infected had learned from Frank's mistake. They'd observed his firing positions, timed his reload sequences, and identified the blind spots in his security setup. When they finally attacked, they did it with a level of tactical sophistication that would have impressed a military commander. They used diversionary tactics, coordinated their assault to overwhelm his defenses, and adapted their approach when he changed his position inside the building. Frank fought well, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The infected were willing to take casualties to achieve their objective, something that gave them a significant advantage over defenders who were trying to preserve their own lives. They sacrificed individuals to learn about his defenses, then used that knowledge to plan a successful assault. Within 30 minutes, Frank's store was overrun, and he was dead. I realized then that my earlier assumption about the infected being primarily interested in spreading their condition was wrong. They were also eliminating threats, securing resources, and establishing control over territory. They were building something, creating a new social order with themselves at the top and normal humans as prey. This wasn't just an outbreak of disease or madness. This was a systematic replacement of human civilization with something else entirely. The temperature outside had dropped to maybe 95 degrees, but the infected showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, they seemed more active in the cooler night air, moving faster and with greater coordination. I watched groups of them clearing buildings methodically, searching for survivors, gathering supplies, and establishing what looked like staging areas for larger operations. Around 1 in the morning, I got a radio transmission that made my blood run cold. One of the police officers Sarah had been in contact with reported that the infected were using vehicles, driving cars and trucks with the same skill they'd possessed before their transformation. They weren't just retaining their intelligence and memories. They were retaining their ability to use tools, operate machinery, and employ technology to achieve their goals. This changed everything. If the infected could drive, they could move quickly between locations, transport larger numbers of their kind, and coordinate operations across the entire city. They weren't limited to whatever they could accomplish on foot. They had access to the same mobility and logistical capabilities that had made human civilization possible in the first place. I started seeing vehicles moving through the streets. Around 2 in the morning, but they weren't driven by normal people fleeing the chaos. These were infected individuals using cars and trucks as tools, transporting other infected to specific locations, delivering supplies to support their operations, and moving with the same purposeful coordination I'd observed in their foot patrols. That's when I realized that my store's location, which I'd chosen for its defensive advantages, was also a liability. I was positioned on a major avenue with good visibility in all directions, but that also made me visible to anyone passing by. Every infected individual who drove past my building could observe my security measures, note my defensive preparations, and add that information to whatever collective intelligence they were building about threats in the area. Around 2:30, I watched something that convinced me the infected were not just organized, but actively planning for long-term objectives. A convoy of 3 vehicles stopped at the intersection 2 blocks from my store. The infected occupants got out, spent maybe 10 minutes surveying the area, and then drove away. They weren't hunting for immediate prey. They were conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for future operations. Sarah contacted me again around 3 o'clock with information that confirmed my worst fears. She'd been monitoring emergency radio frequencies and had picked up transmissions from military units, attempting to establish quarantine zones around Phoenix. But the infected had anticipated this response. They were already positioning themselves to intercept military convoys, using their retained knowledge of tactics and logistics to counter the government's response. The infected weren't just random individuals who'd lost their humanity. They were a coordinated enemy force with access to human knowledge, human skills, and human technology. They could plan, adapt, and execute complex operations with a level of sophistication that made them extremely dangerous to any survivors who tried to oppose them. I spent the next few hours watching and learning, trying to identify patterns in their behavior that might give me an advantage in the confrontation I knew was coming. The infected moved in groups of specific sizes, maintained communication through methods I couldn't identify, and seemed to be following a structured command system. They had objectives, priorities, and the patience to achieve their goals systematically. Around 4 in the morning, I witnessed something that made me realize how much trouble I was in. A group of infected had positioned themselves on rooftops around my store, not to attack, but to observe. They were watching my building, noting my routines, learning my defensive capabilities. They were studying me the same way I was studying them, gathering intelligence for a future assault. But they were also patient. They didn't rush into an attack when they realized I was aware of their presence. Instead, they maintained their observation posts, continued their surveillance, and waited for the right moment to strike. They were thinking strategically, planning for success rather than just reacting to immediate opportunities. The sun started to rise around 5:30, bringing with it the promise of another brutally hot day. The infected didn't retreat with the dawn the way I'd hoped they might. If anything, they seemed to be preparing for increased activity, positioning themselves for operations that would take advantage of the daylight hours. I realized then that I was facing an enemy that combined the worst aspects of human intelligence with the relentless focus of a predator. They could think, plan, and adapt, but they felt no compassion, no fear, no moral constraints. They were everything that made humans dangerous without anything that made humans civilized. The night was ending, but my ordeal was just beginning. I'd learned that the infected were organized, intelligent, and patient. They were planning something, building toward some objective that required them to eliminate threats like me. I had maybe a few hours before they decided to make their move, and I needed to use that time to prepare for the fight of my life. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio again, reporting that the infected were massing in larger numbers throughout the city, preparing for what looked like coordinated operations against the remaining survivor strongholds. The second day of the apocalypse was about to begin, and it was going to be worse than anything we'd experienced so far. The sun came up at 6:15 on Wednesday morning, and with it came heat that felt like opening an oven door. Within an hour, the temperature outside had climbed past 100 degrees, and I knew we were heading for another day of brutal, life-threatening heat. But what I discovered over the next 12 hours was that the desert wasn't just our enemy anymore. It was also our weapon. I'd been watching the infected through my security cameras all night, and as the temperature started climbing, I noticed something interesting about their behavior. They weren't seeking shade the way normal humans would. They continued their patrols, their surveillance, their coordinated movements without any apparent concern for the heat that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. But I also noticed they were moving differently, more slowly, with less of the fluid coordination I'd observed during the cooler night hours. Around 7:30, I watched a group of infected attempt to cross the open parking lot behind my store. The asphalt was already hot enough to burn exposed skin, and the reflected heat created shimmering waves that distorted the air. The infected moved across this furnace without seeking cover, without showing any signs of discomfort, but they were definitely affected by the conditions. Their movements were sluggish, their coordination was off, and they seemed to be having trouble maintaining the tactical precision they'd shown during the night. That's when I realized the heat might be the only advantage I had. The infected retained their human intelligence and memories, but they'd apparently lost their survival instincts regarding environmental hazards. They didn't seek shade, didn't conserve water, didn't take the basic precautions that kept people alive in the desert. They were tough, maybe even immune to normal physical discomfort, but they weren't immune to the laws of physics. Sarah contacted me around 8 o'clock with information that supported my theory. She'd been monitoring the infected from her position at the hospital, and she'd noticed that their activity levels dropped significantly during the hottest parts of the day. They didn't stop moving entirely, but they became less aggressive, less coordinated, and more vulnerable to mistakes. The heat was affecting their motor functions, even if they couldn't feel the discomfort. But Sarah also warned me about something that made my blood run cold. The infected were adapting to the heat faster than she'd expected. The ones who'd been transformed longer were showing signs of acclimatization, developing behaviors that helped them function in extreme temperatures. They were learning to use buildings for cover, to time their movements to avoid the worst heat, and to coordinate their activities around the temperature cycles. This meant I had a window of opportunity, but it was closing fast. The infected were vulnerable during the hottest parts of the day, but they were figuring out how to compensate for that vulnerability. If I was going to use the heat as a weapon, I needed to do it soon, before they learned to counter it effectively. Around 9 o'clock, I started getting radio transmissions from other survivors across the city, and the news was uniformly grim. The group of police officers at the Central Precinct had been overrun during the night. The family in Scottsdale had gone silent. Around 3 in the morning, several other survivors Sarah had been in contact with had stopped responding to radio calls. The infected were systematically eliminating defended positions, using the knowledge they'd gained from each successful assault to improve their tactics for the next target. But I also started hearing from new voices, people who'd managed to survive the first night and were trying to coordinate with other survivors. A mechanic named Rodriguez had secured himself in an auto repair shop with enough tools and supplies to last several days. A teacher named Williams had barricaded herself in an elementary school with a small group of children whose parents hadn't made it through the night. A retired Marine named Jackson had fortified his house and was trying to organize a neighborhood defense. Sarah suggested we try to coordinate our activities to support each other through radio communication and shared intelligence. The infected were organized and working together, so we needed to do the same if we had any hope of survival. She proposed that we establish regular radio check-ins, share information about infected movements and tactics, and work together to plan supply runs and rescue operations. The idea of leaving my fortified store to help other survivors terrified me, but I also realized that isolation was a death sentence. The infected were getting stronger, more organized, and more numerous with each passing hour. If we didn't start working together, they would pick us off one by one until there was no one left to resist them. Around 10:30, I witnessed something that convinced me the infected were planning something bigger than just hunting individual survivors. Convoys of vehicles started moving through the streets, carrying large groups of infected toward the center of the city. They weren't random movements or opportunistic hunting expeditions. These were organized troop movements, coordinated deployments of infected individuals towards specific strategic objectives. I counted at least 50 vehicles. Over the course of an hour, each carrying between 4 and 8 infected individuals. They moved in formation, maintained communication through methods I couldn't identify, and seemed to be following predetermined routes toward predetermined destinations. They were massing for a major operation, something that would require hundreds of infected working together with military precision. Sarah confirmed my observations from her position at the hospital. She could see similar convoys moving through downtown Phoenix, and she'd picked up radio transmissions that suggested the infected were planning coordinated attacks on the few remaining government strongholds. They weren't just trying to spread their infection or eliminate individual threats. They were attempting to complete the collapse of organized human resistance in the Phoenix metropolitan area. The temperature hit 115 degrees around 11 o'clock, and I watched the infected activity slow to a crawl. The ones who'd been transformed recently were having serious problems with motor coordination, moving like they were underwater, struggling to maintain their balance and focus. But the ones who'd been infected longer were still functioning, still maintaining their patrols and surveillance, still preparing for whatever operation they were planning. That's when I realized the infected weren't just adapting to the heat. They were evolving, becoming more efficient, more capable, more dangerous with each passing hour. The transformation wasn't a one-time event that left them as static creatures. It was an ongoing process that continued to change them, to improve their abilities, to make them better suited for survival in their new environment. Around noon, I got a radio call that changed everything. Rodriguez, the mechanic who'd been broadcasting from his auto repair shop, was under attack. He'd been trying to rescue a family trapped in a nearby house when a group of infected had surrounded his position. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. He needed help, and he needed it immediately. Sarah coordinated the response, establishing radio contact with the other survivors and trying to organize a rescue operation. But we were scattered across the city, separated by miles of infected-controlled territory, and none of us had the resources for a major military operation. Rodriguez was a good man, a skilled survivor who'd been sharing valuable intelligence with our group, but saving him would require someone to leave their fortified position and venture into the streets. I made the decision that would define the rest of my survival. I loaded my tactical vest with ammunition, grabbed my AR-15 and 2 backup handguns, and prepared to leave the security of my store for the first time since the outbreak began. I wasn't going to let another good person die while I sat safely behind my steel shutters and bulletproof glass. But I also knew that leaving my store was probably a death sentence. The infected had been watching my building, studying my defenses, learning my routines. They knew I was here, they knew I was armed, and they knew I was a threat to their operations. If I left, I might not be able to get back. If I stayed, Rodriguez would die, and our small network of survivors would lose a valuable member. Sarah tried to talk me out of it, pointing out that I was more valuable to the group alive and fortified than dead in the streets. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help someone who'd been helping us. Rodriguez had shared intelligence, coordinated radio communications, and risked his own safety to scout infected positions. He deserved the same level of commitment from the rest of us. I spent 30 minutes planning my route, using the security cameras and radio intelligence to identify the safest path to Rodriguez's position. The infected were still sluggish from the heat, but they were maintaining their patrols and surveillance. I would have to move fast, stay in whatever shade I could find, and avoid direct confrontation with any groups too large for me to handle alone. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. I would use my vehicle to cover most of the distance, abandoning it when I got close to Rodriguez's position and proceeding on foot for the final approach. I would coordinate with Sarah and the other survivors through radio communication, using their observations to avoid infected patrols and identify threats I couldn't see from ground level. Before I left, I made one final check of my store's security systems. I activated all the locks, armed the backup power systems, and set the security cameras to record everything that happened while I was gone. If I didn't make it back, at least, there would be evidence of what had happened, information that might help other survivors understand what they were dealing with. I also left a message for Sarah, explaining my weapons cache, my supply stores, and my defensive preparations. If something happened to me, she could coordinate with other survivors to secure my store and use its resources to continue the fight. My death wouldn't be meaningless if it contributed to the long-term survival of our group. The heat hit me like a physical blow when I stepped outside. Even with the vehicle's air conditioning, the interior temperature was over 100 degrees. Within minutes. But the infected seemed to be having even more trouble with the conditions. I saw several of them moving with obvious difficulty, their coordination shot, their tactical precision reduced to clumsy shambling. I made it 3 blocks before I encountered my first serious obstacle. A group of infected had established a checkpoint at a major intersection, stopping and examining every vehicle that tried to pass through. They were still functioning despite the heat, still maintaining their organized operations, still working together to achieve their objectives. I had to abandon my original route and find an alternate path through residential neighborhoods, using side streets and alleys to avoid the main thoroughfares where the infected were maintaining their heaviest surveillance. This added time to my journey, time that Rodriguez might not have, but it also kept me away from the organized groups that could have easily overwhelmed me. Around 1 o'clock, I reached the area where Rodriguez was trapped. The infected had surrounded his auto repair shop, but they weren't attempting to break in immediately. Instead, they were maintaining a perimeter, watching and waiting, demonstrating the same tactical patience I'd observed at my own store. They knew Rodriguez was inside. They knew he was armed, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike. I positioned myself in an abandoned building across the street from Rodriguez's shop, using the elevation to observe the infected positions and plan my approach. There were maybe 15 of them, spread out around the building, maintaining visual contact with each other and coordinating their movements through subtle signals I couldn't interpret. The rescue operation required split-second timing and perfect coordination. I would use the radio to coordinate with Rodriguez, creating a diversion that would draw the infected away from his position while providing covering fire for his escape. Sarah would monitor the situation from her position at the hospital, providing intelligence about infected movements and coordinating with other survivors who might be able to provide support. The plan almost worked. Rodriguez made it out of his building and reached the rally point where I was waiting, But the infected had anticipated our tactics, positioning additional groups to intercept any rescue attempt. We found ourselves surrounded by more infected than I'd ever seen in one place, facing an enemy that had learned from our previous successes and adapted their tactics accordingly. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. The infected pressed their attack with relentless determination, accepting casualties in order to overwhelm our defenses. They used coordinated rushes, flanking maneuvers, and suppressive tactics that would have impressed a military commander. They weren't just mindless monsters anymore. They were soldiers in an army that was fighting to replace human civilization with something else entirely. Rodriguez didn't make it. He fought bravely, used his ammunition efficiently, and bought us time to establish a defensive position. But there were too many of them. They were too well organized, and they were willing to sacrifice themselves to achieve their objectives. He died protecting the children we'd been trying to rescue, buying them enough time to escape while we retreated to a more defensible position. I learned something crucial during that firefight. The infected weren't just retaining their human intelligence and memories. They were sharing information, coordinating their activities across large distances, and adapting their tactics based on the experiences of individual groups. They were becoming more dangerous with each encounter, learning from their mistakes, and improving their effectiveness. By 2:30, I was back at my store, but I wasn't the same person who'd left 3 hours earlier. I'd seen the infected operating as a coordinated military force, using tactics and strategies that suggested they were planning something much larger than just hunting individual survivors. They were building toward an objective that would require massive coordination, extensive resources, and the elimination of all organized human resistance. The heat was still brutal, still slowing down their operations, but they were adapting faster than I'd hoped. The ones who'd been infected longer were showing signs of genuine acclimatization, developing behaviors that let them function effectively even in extreme temperatures. My window of opportunity was closing, and I needed to use it while I still could. Sarah contacted me as soon as I returned, confirming that the infected were massing in even larger numbers throughout the city. They were preparing for something big, something that would happen soon, and we needed to be ready for it. The second day was ending, but the worst was yet to come. The radio crackled to life at 3:15 that afternoon with transmissions that confirmed my worst fears. Sarah's voice was strained, professional calm barely masking the terror underneath as she reported what she was seeing from her position at Phoenix General Hospital. The infected weren't just gathering in larger numbers. They were organizing into something that looked like a military command structure, with clear hierarchies, defined roles, and coordinated objectives that spanned the entire city. According to Sarah, the convoys I'd observed earlier weren't random troop movements. They were part of a systematic deployment of infected forces to key strategic locations throughout Phoenix. The main airport, the power stations, the water treatment facilities, the major highways leading out of the city. They were securing infrastructure, establishing control points, and cutting off escape routes with the precision of a professional army. But what really frightened me was Sarah's description of the infected individuals who seemed to be directing these operations. They moved differently from the others, with more purposeful coordination, and they appeared to be communicating with distant groups through methods that didn't rely on technology. They were leaders, commanders, strategic thinkers who retained not just their human intelligence, but their capacity for long-term planning and complex operations. The implications were staggering. The infected weren't just a disease that turned people into mindless predators. They were a replacement species that could organize, adapt, and execute military campaigns. They had access to human knowledge, human technology, and human infrastructure, but they were using these resources to build something that was fundamentally inhuman in its objectives and methods. Around 4 o'clock, I started picking up radio. transmissions from government and military sources that painted an even bleaker picture. The infection had spread beyond Phoenix to every major city in the Southwest. Las Vegas, Albuquerque, Tucson, El Paso, all reporting similar outbreaks with similar patterns of rapid organization and strategic thinking among the infected populations. The federal government was mobilizing military resources, but the infected were anticipating these responses and positioning themselves to counter them. A National Guard commander broadcasting from Luke Air Force Base reported that infected individuals were using captured vehicles and equipment to establish roadblocks and defensive positions along major transportation routes. They weren't just trying to spread their infection randomly. They were implementing a coordinated strategy to prevent military reinforcement and civilian evacuation, trapping the remaining human population in infected-controlled urban areas. The scope of what we were dealing with became clear when Sarah managed to contact survivors in other cities. The pattern was consistent everywhere. Initial outbreak through contaminated water supplies, rapid transformation of large population segments, immediate organization into tactical units, and systematic elimination of government and military resistance. This wasn't a natural disaster or an accidental outbreak. This was a coordinated assault on human civilization by something that had been planning and preparing for a very long time. Sarah had been analyzing medical data from the hospital's computer systems, trying to understand the biological mechanism behind the transformation. What she discovered was even more disturbing than the tactical implications. The infected weren't just retaining their human intelligence. They were sharing it, creating a collective consciousness that allowed individual groups to access the knowledge and experiences of the entire infected population. This explained how they could adapt so quickly to new situations, how they could coordinate operations across vast distances without apparent communication technology, and how they could learn from the experiences of infected individuals they'd never directly encountered. They weren't just smarter than individual humans. They were smarter than human civilization itself, with access to the accumulated knowledge of every person they'd transformed. Around 5 o'clock, the radio transmissions from military sources became increasingly desperate. Air Force bases were reporting that infected personnel had sabotaged aircraft and communication equipment before their transformation became apparent. Army units were finding their supply lines cut by infected civilians who knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Navy installations were dealing with infected sailors who retained their technical knowledge, but used it to disable critical systems rather than maintain them. The infected weren't just spreading randomly through the population. They were targeting people with specific knowledge and skills, prioritizing the transformation of individuals who could contribute to their strategic objectives. Military personnel, government officials, technical specialists, anyone with access to critical infrastructure or specialized knowledge was being specifically hunted and converted. I realized then that my gun store made me a high-priority target, not just because of the weapons and ammunition I possessed, but because of my knowledge of tactics, firearms, and defensive operations. The infected wanted to transform me, to add my expertise to their collective intelligence, to use my skills against the remaining human population. They weren't just trying to kill me, they were trying to recruit me. Sarah confirmed this theory with observations from the hospital. The infected had made systematic attempts to capture, rather than kill, medical personnel, particularly doctors and nurses with specialized knowledge. They seemed to understand that certain individuals were more valuable as converts than as victims, and they were willing to invest significant resources in securing these high-value targets. This changed my understanding of the tactical situation completely. The infected weren't just trying to eliminate threats to their expansion. They were trying to acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to complete their takeover of human civilization. Every expert they converted, every specialist they transformed, every professional, they captured made them stronger and more capable of achieving their ultimate objectives. Around 6 o'clock, I received a radio transmission that made my blood run cold. A group of infected had approached Williams, the elementary school teacher who'd been sheltering a group of children, but they hadn't attempted to break into her fortified position. Instead, they'd made contact through the building's intercom system, speaking in calm, rational voices, trying to convince her to surrender voluntarily. They'd offered to guarantee the safety of the children, promised that the transformation process was painless, claimed that the infected were building a better world without the violence and suffering that characterized human society. They weren't using threats or force. They were using persuasion, psychological manipulation, and logical arguments to convince her that resistance was futile and cooperation was the rational choice. Williams had refused their offer, but the fact that they'd made it at all revealed something terrifying about how sophisticated the infected had become. They understood human psychology, human motivations, and human decision-making processes well enough to craft compelling arguments for voluntary surrender. They were fighting a war for hearts and minds, not just territory and resources. Sarah reported similar incidents at other survivor locations. The infected were making contact with barricaded groups, offering deals, making promises, and using every psychological tool available to convince people to surrender without a fight. They understood that voluntary conversion was more efficient than forced transformation, and they were willing to invest time and effort in persuasion when direct assault would be too costly. The sun started setting around 7:30, bringing with it the promise of cooler temperatures and increased infected activity. I'd learned during the previous night that the infected were more active and more dangerous after dark, when the desert heat no longer slowed their coordination and tactical precision. But now I knew they were also more organized, more numerous, and more strategically focused than they'd been just 24 hours earlier. Around 8 o'clock, Sarah made contact with what remained of the government's emergency response network. The news was uniformly catastrophic. Phoenix was completely cut off from outside assistance, with all major transportation routes blocked by infected forces. The National Guard units that had attempted to enter the city had been systematically ambushed and destroyed by infected groups that seemed to know exactly where and when they would arrive. The federal government was implementing a containment strategy, establishing quarantine zones around affected cities and preparing to use extreme measures to prevent the infection from spreading to unaffected areas. They were talking about nuclear options, about sacrificing the infected cities to save the rest of the country, about writing off millions of people as acceptable losses in a war against an enemy they didn't understand. This meant that even if I survived the immediate crisis, even if I managed to outlast the infected forces in Phoenix, I might still die in a nuclear fire designed to sterilize the entire metropolitan area. The government was preparing to abandon us, to treat every person in the quarantine zone as a potential threat that needed to be eliminated rather than rescued. Sarah and I started discussing evacuation options, trying to identify routes out of the city that might still be open, but the infected had anticipated this possibility. They'd established checkpoints and patrols along every major highway, every back road, every possible escape route. They weren't just trying to control Phoenix. They were trying to trap everyone inside it, to prevent any human survivors from reaching the outside world with information about what was really happening. Around 9 o'clock, I received the radio transmission that convinced me the infected were preparing for their final assault on the remaining survivor strongholds. Multiple groups were reporting massive troop movements, with hundreds of infected individuals moving through the streets in coordinated formations. They were massing for simultaneous attacks on every defended position, planning to eliminate all organized human resistance in a single, overwhelming operation. But they weren't rushing into their attacks the way they had during the early stages of the outbreak. They were taking time to position their forces, to coordinate their timing, to ensure that their assault would be successful. They'd learned from their previous encounters with defended positions, and they were applying that knowledge to develop tactics that would overwhelm even the most prepared survivors. Sarah confirmed that the hospital was surrounded by more infected than she'd ever seen in one place. They weren't attempting to break in immediately, but they were clearly preparing for a major assault. Williams reported similar massing around the elementary school. Jackson, the retired Marine, was seeing infected forces gathering in his neighborhood in numbers that suggested they were planning to attack every house simultaneously. The pattern was clear. The infected were preparing for a coordinated operation that would eliminate all remaining human resistance in Phoenix. They'd spent the previous 2 days gathering intelligence, learning our capabilities, and developing tactics specifically designed to counter our defensive measures. Now they were ready to implement their final solution to the human problem. Around 10 o'clock, I started seeing the same massing of forces around my own store. Groups of infected were positioning themselves on rooftops, in abandoned buildings, and in strategic locations that would give them overlapping fields of fire and multiple angles of attack. They weren't just planning to overwhelm my defenses through sheer numbers. They were planning to outmaneuver me, to use sophisticated tactics that would neutralize my advantages in weaponry and defensive positioning. What made this even more terrifying was the realization that they were coordinating their assault timing across the entire city. Sarah reported that the infected forces around the hospital were moving into final positions at exactly the same time as the groups around my store. Williams saw similar positioning around the elementary school. They were preparing for simultaneous attacks that would prevent any survivor group from providing assistance to the others. I spent the next hour making final preparations for what I knew would be the fight of my life. I positioned ammunition caches throughout the store, set up defensive firing positions that would give me clear sight lines to all approaches, and activated every security system I'd installed over the years. But I also knew that all my preparations might not be enough against an enemy that had been studying my defenses and developing specific tactics to counter them. Sarah and I maintained radio contact, sharing intelligence about infected movements and coordinating our defensive plans as much as possible. But we both knew that once the attacks began, we would be on our own. The infected had successfully isolated every survivor group, cutting off our ability to provide mutual support and forcing us to face their assault alone. Around 11 o'clock, the infected around my store stopped their positioning movements and settled into what looked like pre-assault formations. They weren't attacking yet, but they were clearly ready to begin their operation at a predetermined signal. The waiting was almost worse than active combat, knowing that hundreds of intelligent, coordinated enemies were preparing to overwhelm my position using tactics they developed specifically for my situation. The radio transmissions from other survivor locations became increasingly tense as everyone reported similar preparations around their positions. We were all facing the same coordinated assault, all about to be tested by an enemy that had learned from every previous encounter and adapted their tactics accordingly. That's when Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. While monitoring the infected communications through electronic surveillance equipment at the hospital, she'd detected organized radio transmissions between infected groups. They were using human technology, human communication protocols, and human coordination methods to manage their operations. But they were also using these systems to share tactical intelligence and coordinate their timing across the entire city. This meant that disrupting their communications might disrupt their coordination, might create opportunities for individual survivor groups to break out of the encirclement and link up with each other. If we could interfere with their command and control systems, we might be able to turn their organizational advantage against them. But it also meant that the final assault was imminent. The infected were making their final communications, confirming their positions, and preparing to launch their coordinated attack on every remaining human stronghold in Phoenix. The siege was about to begin, and everything I'd learned, everything I'd prepared for, everything I'd planned would be put to the ultimate test. The third day was ending, but the real battle was just beginning. The assault began at midnight exactly, coordinated across every survivor position in Phoenix with military precision that confirmed everything I'd feared about the infected's organizational capabilities. The first indication wasn't gunfire or breaking glass, but the sudden silence of all radio communications as the infected jammed every frequency we'd been using to coordinate our resistance. They'd learned from observing our operations, and they were systematically eliminating every advantage we'd developed over the past 3 days. Sarah's voice cut through the static one final time before the communications blackout took effect. Completely. She reported massive explosions at strategic points throughout the city, infected forces using captured military equipment to destroy power substations, communication towers, and transportation infrastructure. They weren't just attacking individual survivor positions. They were dismantling the entire technological foundation that might allow organized human resistance to re-establish itself. The infected around my store moved with coordinated precision that would have impressed the most experienced military commanders. They approached from multiple directions simultaneously, using suppressive fire to pin me down while assault teams advanced on my primary defensive positions. But what made their attack truly terrifying was how well they understood my capabilities, my ammunition reserves, and my tactical limitations. They'd been watching me for 3 days, studying every aspect of my defensive preparations, learning my routines and identifying the weaknesses in my security systems. When they finally attacked, they knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. They targeted my power supply first, cutting the electrical lines that fed my security systems and forcing me to rely on battery backup that wouldn't last more than a few hours. The infected team that hit my power supply moved with the expertise of professional electricians, shutting down my systems without triggering the backup generators or damaging equipment they might want to capture intact. They weren't just trying to kill me, they were trying to preserve my store's infrastructure for their own use, treating my weapons and ammunition as resources to be acquired rather than destroyed. I retreated to my predetermined fallback position in the store's interior, using the reinforced walls and narrow corridors to limit their ability to overwhelm me with superior numbers. But even as I fought, I could hear them coordinating their movements through verbal commands shouted in voices that sounded completely human. They retained their ability to speak, to plan, to adapt their tactics in real time based on my responses to their assault. The firefight lasted for over an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Every round I fired was answered by coordinated suppressive fire from multiple positions, forcing me to constantly relocate to avoid being pinned down and overrun. The infected pressed their attack with relentless determination, accepting casualties that would have broken the morale of any human assault force, but continuing their advance with mechanical persistence. What saved my life during those first crucial minutes was something I'd learned from watching Frank Morrison's store get overrun 2 nights earlier. The infected were willing to sacrifice individuals to achieve their objectives, but they also learned from each casualty, adapting their tactics to avoid repeating the same mistakes. I used this against them, setting up defensive positions that would channel their attacks into predetermined killing zones where I could inflict maximum casualties while minimizing my own exposure. But I also knew that my ammunition was limited. My defensive positions were being systematically compromised, and reinforcements weren't coming. Every infected individual I eliminated was immediately replaced by 2 more, who'd learned from observing their predecessors' failure. I was fighting an enemy that could adapt faster than I could innovate, learn quicker than I could teach, and coordinate better than any human military force I'd ever encountered. Around 1:30 in the morning, the infected changed their tactics completely. Instead of continuing their direct assault, They settled into siege positions around my store and began what could only be described as psychological warfare. They started talking to me, using voices I recognized from customers who'd frequented my store over the years, people I'd known and liked before their transformation. Mrs. Patterson's voice was among them, which should have been impossible since I'd killed her 3 days earlier. But there it was, clear and unmistakable, speaking in the same polite, grandmotherly tone she'd used when asking about ammunition for her revolver. She was explaining how peaceful the transformation process was, how much better life could be without the fear and uncertainty that plagued normal human existence. The infected had learned to use psychological manipulation as a weapon, employing the voices and memories of people I'd cared about to break down my emotional defenses. They understood that human beings were social creatures who could be influenced through appeals to relationships, shared experiences, and emotional connections. They were trying to convince me that resistance was futile, that transformation was inevitable, and that cooperation would be rewarded while defiance would only lead to unnecessary suffering. But their psychological assault revealed something crucial about their nature that I'd only suspected before. The infected weren't just retaining individual memories and personalities. They were accessing a collective database of human experiences, able to reproduce the speech patterns, mannerisms, and emotional appeals of anyone who'd been transformed. They were using human psychology against itself, turning our greatest strength as a species into a weapon for our own destruction. Around 2 o'clock, I made radio contact with Sarah using an emergency frequency the infected hadn't identified. Yet, her situation was even worse than mine. The hospital was completely surrounded, and infected forces had begun systematically cutting off her escape routes while maintaining constant pressure on her defensive position. But she'd also made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about what we were fighting. Sarah had been monitoring infected communications using hospital equipment that operated on frequencies the infected thought were secure. What she'd discovered was that the infected weren't just sharing tactical information. They were uploading and downloading complete memory sets, transferring the entire knowledge base of transformed individuals to the collective consciousness that guided their operations. This meant that every human being they transformed didn't just become another soldier in their army. They became a repository of knowledge that strengthened the entire infected population. Every doctor, engineer, soldier, or specialist they converted made every other infected individual smarter, more capable, and more dangerous. They weren't just spreading an infection. They were systematically harvesting human civilization itself. But Sarah had also identified a potential weakness in their system. The infected relied on technological infrastructure to maintain their communications and coordinate their operations. If that infrastructure could be disrupted, if their ability to share information could be compromised, they might revert to acting as individuals rather than as a coordinated collective force. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah transmitted the location of a communication relay station that seemed to be central to the infected's coordination network. It was heavily defended, probably impossible for any individual survivor to assault successfully, but it represented our only chance to turn the tactical situation around. If we could disrupt their communications, we might be able to break up their coordinated assault and create opportunities to escape their encirclement. The plan that developed over the next hour was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was also our only hope for survival. I would break out of my store's defensive perimeter, fighting my way through infected forces to reach Sarah's position at the hospital. Together, we would assault the communication relay station, using our combined firepower and tactical knowledge to overcome its defenses and destroy the equipment that enabled infected coordination. It was a plan that required everything to go perfectly, that depended on timing that couldn't be off by more than a few minutes, and that would probably result in both our deaths even if we succeeded. But it was also the only alternative to slow death by siege, gradual depletion of our resources, and eventual capture by enemies who wanted to add our knowledge to their collective intelligence. Around 4 o'clock, I began preparing for the breakout that would either save us or kill us. I loaded every weapon I could carry, filled my tactical vest with ammunition and emergency supplies, and rigged my store with explosive charges that would deny the infected access to my weapons cache if I didn't survive to return. If I was going to die, I was going to make sure my death contributed to the larger fight against the infected threat. The breakout began at 4:30, timed to coincide with Sarah's own escape attempt from the hospital. We coordinated our movements, using coded radio transmissions, trying to draw infected forces away from each other's positions by creating multiple, simultaneous threats they would have to respond to individually. Fighting my way out of the store was like walking through a nightmare that had learned military tactics. The infected responded to my breakout with coordinated counterattacks that anticipated my most likely routes and prepared ambushes at strategic choke points. They weren't just reacting to my movements. They were predicting them, using their knowledge of human psychology and tactical doctrine to stay one step ahead of every decision I made. But I also had advantages they couldn't entirely counter. I knew Phoenix's street layout better than most people. I'd spent years developing tactical skills specifically for urban combat situations, and I was fighting with the desperate determination of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Every intersection became a battlefield. Every alley became a potential ambush site. Every building became either cover or a trap depending on how quickly I could assess and respond to changing conditions. The journey to Sarah's position took almost 2 hours, 2 hours of constant combat against enemies who seemed to anticipate my every move. But it also revealed something important about the infected's tactical limitations. While they could coordinate brilliantly as a group, individual infected were still bound by human physical capabilities. They could be outmaneuvered, surprised, and defeated if you could force them to fight as individuals rather than as part of their collective force. I reached the hospital around 6:30 in the morning, just as Sarah was beginning her own breakout attempt. We coordinated our final approach using hand signals, moving with the synchronization that only came from hours of shared combat experience. Sarah had proven herself to be as capable a fighter as any soldier I'd ever worked with, adapting to tactical situations with the same analytical precision she'd used as a medical professional. The assault on the communication relay station was the most intense fighting either of us had ever experienced. The infected had positioned their most capable defenders around the facility, creating overlapping fields of fire and mutually supporting positions that would have challenged a full military unit. But they'd also made a crucial mistake by concentrating their forces around the relay station, leaving other areas less heavily defended. Sarah and I approached the facility from opposite directions, using coordinated attacks to divide the infected defenders' attention and create opportunities to advance on our primary objective. The fighting was close quarters, brutal, and absolutely without mercy from either side. The infected fought with mechanical persistence, accepting casualties that would have broken any human force, while we fought with the desperate ferocity of people who knew that failure meant not just death, but the end of human civilization itself. The communication equipment was more sophisticated than either of us had expected, clearly modified and enhanced by infected individuals who'd retained their technical knowledge. But it was also vulnerable to the same kind of physical destruction that would disable any electronic system. Sarah used her medical knowledge to identify critical components, while I provided covering fire against infected reinforcements who were converging on our position. The explosion that destroyed the relay station was visible from miles away, sending a pillar of fire and smoke into the pre-dawn sky that could be seen throughout Phoenix. But more importantly, the destruction of the communication hub had an immediate effect on infected coordination throughout the city. The synchronized attacks faltered, the tactical precision dissolved, and individual infected groups began acting independently rather than as part of a unified force. Sarah and I used the confusion to fight our way back toward the hospital, where we'd identified a defensible position that could serve as a rally point for other survivors. The infected were still dangerous, still numerous, and still capable of coordinated action on a local level. But they'd lost their ability to coordinate operations across the entire city, creating opportunities for human survivors to regroup and organize their own resistance efforts. We reached the hospital around 8 o'clock, just as the sun was beginning to rise on what would be the 4th day of the outbreak. We'd survived the siege, disrupted the infected coordination network, and proven that the enemy could be defeated through coordinated human action. But we'd also learned that the infected threat was more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more adaptable than anyone had imagined. The hospital became our new base of operations, a fortified position where we could coordinate with other survivors, plan rescue operations, and begin the long process of rebuilding human resistance to the infected threat. Sarah's medical knowledge and my tactical expertise complemented each other perfectly, creating a leadership team that could address both the immediate survival needs and the long-term strategic challenges we would face. Over the next few hours, we made contact with other survivors throughout Phoenix, people who'd managed to survive the coordinated assault and were now emerging from their hiding places to assess the changed tactical situation. Williams had survived at the elementary school, protecting her group of children through 3 days of siege. Jackson had held his neighborhood position, organizing his neighbors into an effective defensive force. We began coordinating these scattered groups into a unified resistance network, sharing intelligence about infected positions, coordinating supply runs to support isolated survivors, and planning operations to reclaim key infrastructure points throughout the city. The infected still controlled most of Phoenix, but they no longer had the overwhelming coordination advantage that had made them nearly invincible during the first 3 days. Sarah and I established regular radio communications with survivor groups in other cities, sharing intelligence about infected tactics and coordinating resistance strategies across the entire southwestern region. We learned that similar communication disruption operations had been successful in Las Vegas and Tucson, breaking up infected coordination networks and creating opportunities for human survivors to reestablish organized resistance. The fight was far from over. The infected were already adapting to the loss of their communication network, developing new coordination methods and adjusting their tactics to counter our successful operations. They remained a formidable enemy with access to human knowledge, human technology, and human infrastructure. But they were no longer invincible, no longer able to coordinate their operations with the precision that had made them so dangerous during the early stages of the outbreak. As the 4th day began, Sarah and I knew that we'd survived the worst of the initial assault, but we also knew that the real war was just beginning. The infected weren't going to give up easily, and they would continue to evolve, adapt, and develop new strategies for achieving their objectives. But human beings had proven that we could fight back, that we could organize, and that we could defeat an enemy that had seemed unstoppable just 72 hours earlier. The first 3 days of the zombie apocalypse had tested everything thought I knew about survival, tactics, and human nature. But they'd also proven that preparation, determination, and coordinated action could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy. The infected had underestimated human adaptability, human resilience, and human capacity for cooperation in the face of existential threats. We'd lost Phoenix, at least temporarily, but we'd gained something more valuable. We'd learned how to fight back, how to coordinate our resistance, and how to use the infected's own organizational sophistication against them. The apocalypse wasn't over, but neither was the human race.